think before you speak. Like, if you're going to come at bodybuilding, bro, like, have a constructed argument.
Do you think that drug-free bodybuilding, where they're testing like they do for all athletes in the Olympics, can be an Olympic sport, can make it to the Olympics one day? Do you think that could be a thing? Okay, so let's talk about this. I asked a question, and I think it was brought up because it was around the Olympics, the time of the Olympics in the
Mm.
summer on the YouTube. I think that's where we can discuss this, or you can give your insight on this because you wrote a paper on this. Is bodybuilding a sport? And why don't you kick this off? I think this will be super interesting for those tuning in because, well, I think it's an interesting topic and I think many can appreciate it. So let's go in this direction.
Yeah, I think I've never heard a good argument that bodybuilding is not a sport. And I am not confident saying bodybuilding is a sport, but I will say that we don't have a sufficiently clear criteria that everyone agrees on or that is logically defensible to say what isn't a sport. So really, like when someone goes, "Oh, bodybuilding is a sport because it's subjective." I'm like, there's a ton of subjective sports. Try again. Oh, bodybuilding isn't a sport because there's no performance on the day, or the performance on the day is easier than the training. Like, okay, there's a ton like that. Like a 100-meter sprint, it's hard, but you train way more volume, way more frequently than you do on the day, and you tapered and you go in. If you're just running one 100-meter sprint, okay, one high jump, like, come on. Think before you speak. Like, if you're going to come at bodybuilding, bro, like, have a constructed argument. And that was actually what prompted that paper. The paper we wrote is actually in the domain of philosophy. And there was a paper published by Arianossi a few years back that claimed bodybuilding is not a sport. And they put forth multiple criteria. And I think some of them had valid points, but there are some big errors specifically related to the points. And I got reached out to by a now colleague of mine, Dr. Adrian Kind, who has a PhD in the philosophy of mind and also does philosophy of sport. And he was like, "Hey, I don't know if bodybuilding is a sport." And I said, "I don't know either." He said, "But I don't think this argument is sufficient to say it's not a sport. And I'd like to write a rebuttal." And I was like, "Absolutely, we can do that." So our paper essentially rebuts the points that Arianossi made. And they centered around a few different facets. And one of them that was kind of most egregious in anyone who's participated in the sport is that there's no actual dynamic performance, that you just stand there, basically, and you're being judged. It's a pageant. But posing is actually something that impacts your placing. And there was an argument made that it is not the posing that's judged, but the results of the posing that are judged. And I think that is true. And maybe if you leaned into that maybe a little more, you could try to make some type of argument. Because if we look at other subjective sports, even the ones that are like, when I say gymnastics, people are like, "That's not the same." Like, look at the amazing athleticism. But let's not talk about artistic gymnastics, which is the one that we're all most familiar with, Simone Biles, right? Let's talk about rhythmic gymnastics, also an Olympic sport, definitely recognized. Rhythmic gymnastics specifically, and as like the ribbon,
Hmm.
and it is and like the artistic movement of the ribbon. Like, definitely, these are still athletes. They look amazing. They're doing cool movements, and some elements of artistic gymnastics are occurring along with it. But they're also being judged on how they move a ribbon,
True.
which is pretty subjective. How do you gauge the artistry in it? It is a blended element of artistic performance and sporting performance. I think another really good example is competitive dance, like breakdancing, which was in the Olympics recently. It's probably not coming back, and there was obviously some controversy
Really?
around that.
I know it was in the Olympics, but I didn't know that they were like, okay, we had enough of this. This was a one-time thing.
I mean, who knows? But there's a
Okay.
lot of sports that come to the Olympics once and they go away for various reasons. Sometimes,
Okay.
okay, we have 20 combat sports. We don't need to keep karate or taekwondo here, but we'll bring it for 1 year type of deal. We already got judo, or whatever argument it is, or that can be in a World Games thing. Like, there's various arguments, and many people don't just accept that just because something is in the Olympics, it's therefore a sport. But we kind of have to default to that, because if we actually look at philosophers of sport, they have not actually come up with necessary and sufficient conditions to define what a sport is. So, necessary and sufficient are kind of some cornerstones of philosophy and logic, where you need to have these definitions in place. It is both sufficient to meet these criteria and necessary. But if you don't have necessary and sufficient conditions, you can just describe what are certain characteristics that must be sufficient to be a sport, but not necessarily necessary. And then you have this ambiguity, and it's kind of the difference between innocent and not guilty. And I think that's where we're at with sport is that we can state that some things are not a sport, but how can we find criteria that makes all things we consider a sport a sport? In some ways, it's kind of a fun debate, but when people don't think it through, they're easily defeatable debating things. So this is kind of a fun party trick. Like if someone wants to argue with me about whether or not bodybuilding is a sport, I'll probably win that argument at a party. But if you were to ask me, can you provide necessary and sufficient conditions for what is a sport and show me how bodybuilding is a sport? I'd be like, no, but no one can. And no one has been able to for centuries, but that's true of any sport. So I think the real question is, does bodybuilding function as a sport in our society? And I think the answer is yes. It is a competition that you have to train for years for. You're ranked, you're scored. There are standards. They're no more or less subjective than other subjective sports, in my opinion, like diving or gymnastics or other examples you could think of.
Synchronized swimming.
And yeah, I mean, like I think competitive dance is a really good comparison.
That's a good one, though. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because it is an art. It starts out as an art, which I think you could definitely make the case for posing, physique development. There's an undeniable artistic element. I think the error some people make, or at least was made by Arianossi, it's either art or sport. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Something can have elements of both. And really what changes it is once you start competing. Maybe it's because of my background in hip hop. Like breakdancing is an art form, but there's battles. MCing, rapping is an art form, but there's battles. DJing, but there's battles. Even graph writing, like all these pieces of hip hop, they have artistic forms. And then you start competing. Then okay, if we're going to compete and we want to officially decide who wins, we have to create rules. And then we have to create a league. And so there are breakdancing world championships. And at that point, in breakdancing specifically, it is a physically demanding, highly challenging thing you have to regularly train for. And you're going to go compete in front of judges and you can win. You can place second. You can place third. Functionally, it becomes a sport, the sportified version of an art. And even martial arts, like katas or some of the forms. And, like if you go to a karate competition, winning the kata or a taekwondo competition or certain elements of it are more related to how amazing it looked, the performance aspect, rather than who scored more points in the opponent. So the idea that there are these hard, well-defined lines between sport and art, I think is just not true. And the more you lean into the competitive side of it, then it becomes much more like a sport rather than an art. And I think esports is another really good example of this. There is no physical, well, that's not true. There is a physical component, but it's de-emphasized compared to other sports. It's more about reaction timing, fast decision making, etc. And many games are artistic masterpieces with the storylines, the art involved, the design, yet people are competing in them. I think we just have to acknowledge that various things that humans do can be expressed on more the artistic or performance side. And competitive bodybuilding is obviously much more on the competitive side, and it functions as a sport in society. That's about as far as I can get. You got to train for it. You can't just rock up any day of the week and do it randomly. It's not random who wins either. So for all intents and purposes, in my opinion, well-ran competitive bodybuilding is a sport. And if you don't pose properly on game day, you can lose to someone with a sufficiently good physique who poses better than you, who therefore makes their physique appear better, right? So the decisions you make on game day do influence your outcomes. You have to train for it. And there is an organized competitive structure. So yeah, it's not the easiest thing to defend as a sport, but it's certainly not easy to say it's not a sport, in my opinion. If you feel like it's not legitimate as another sport, if you feel it's not as hard, if you feel it's silly, that's fine. And you can say bodybuilding is silly. Bodybuilding is not as hard as another sport, or it's not hardest on game day competition, or it doesn't seem professional. But that just means you don't like aspects of it. And those things may even be objectively true if you were to drop things, but it doesn't necessarily mean, and therefore it's not a sport, because then you also have to apply that same criteria to every sport if you want to make a categorical claim like that. And then we lose a whole bunch of other things that we've decided are sports.
Right. There's levels to it, I think, for sure. And who's to say, right? I mean, the people who run the Olympics, for example, I mean, they're just people at the end of the day. They're letting in what they want to let in. So now it's a sport and legit because the Olympics allowed it in, for example, right? I mean, you brought up something funny, and I want to go back to this Olympics thing because that's kind of where I was leading to. You were talking about hip hop, and then I thought about the rap battles and how that's a legitimate thing. Like, so is that a sport? I mean, what's the fine line between a sport and a game? Like, you got chess and checkers and like real competitions there.
Now, that is actually something that there's a little more writing about in the philosophy of sport is what makes something a a physical sport or a game. And
Okay.
just simply being a competition isn't technically enough to make something a physical sport. So
Okay.
there does need to be an element of a physical task that is challenging, that has the ability to be ranked. And just simply having ranking, that's only one of the criteria. Having a demanding physical performance on game day that can impact placing, that's another criteria. And I think that's kind of what really delineates between games or mental sports like chess versus physical sports. That's probably where that line gets drawn in the sand. A really good conversation to have would probably be with Adrian on this, Dr. Kind. You know,
Okay.
he brought me in because I have an intimate knowledge of
Bodybuilding.
bodybuilding.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay.
Some of the claims that were made by the original person was, oh, you just stand there and it's not a dynamic movement. You're just flexing. And I'm like, hold on, like an isometric contraction doesn't count as physical activity anymore. So now like the Hercules hold, like the Iron Cross,
Yeah.
that's not hard anymore. Like there were some really basic misunderstandings of honestly physiology that went into it. And also that actually your posing is sometimes judged because there's different categories and divisions. Like your stage presence and walk is judged more in different divisions than others. In modern bodybuilding in most federations, your actual posing routine is no longer judged. But if you're in classic or if you're in bikini or if you're in figure, they literally say, we're not judging the physique here. We're judging the stage presence, and that's part of your score. And if we were to talk about the years of the fitness division, where you're actually supposed to do semi gymnastic events, and it's basically like figure plus a floor
Right.
routine, they're specifically state if you read the like the IFBB because it still exists in the international. It's like a less populated division, but it still falls under the umbrella of bodybuilding. Now you go, okay, that is the sport. They actually are. We're judging whether their one-handed push-ups they did in the middle of the routine is better than that person's backflip, and we're judging the physique. In certain divisions under the umbrella of bodybuilding, there's really no argument that could be made. So if that original paper that we rebutted had said in this category of bodybuilding, when it is expressed this way, they might have had a better argument, but they didn't. It was just too broad sweeping ultimately.
Right.
So,
Right. Okay, that's now I understand the inspiration behind that. And
yeah.
here's the big question, the question that many are maybe even curious about. Do you think that bodybuilding, drug-free bodybuilding, where they're testing like they do for all athletes in the Olympics, can be an Olympic sport, can make it to the Olympics one day? We're talking about drug-free bodybuilding. Do you think that could be a thing?
I think it's got a decent chance at getting back into the World Games because it's already been there. Powerlifting is in the World Games. Bodybuilding was until '09. And I think it would take someone coming to the IOC, doing all the things they need to do, organizing it by committee, having the infrastructure, taking it seriously, and going, hey, we've actually been able to follow the WADA testing guidelines, and we've done additional testing on top of that. That's what we want to do as the community. That's fine. And saying, you know, we recognize the issues of why it was removed in '09. We fixed that. We would like to reapply to have, you know, bodybuilding in the World Games again. I could see that happening. I don't know if it would make it to the Olympics specifically. I think the argument for having powerlifting in the Olympics is, well, here's the thing. The argument against powerlifting is that it's too redundant with weightlifting. There's already a strength sport there. We've seen other combat sports get pulled, like I mentioned earlier, because there's quote unquote too many. And powerlifting is very clearly a sport. It very clearly has the organization. It's already in the World Games. It's growing. Will it get in the Olympics? I don't know. And maybe you could say that because there's nothing really like bodybuilding in the Olympics, it could find its own place. But I think probably the first step would be to get back in the World Games. And that would be a huge, huge move if bodybuilding actually could get in the World Games again as a more seriously drug tested event. I don't know that we'd get there as natural bodybuilding because I think the view of the Olympics and the view of big sport is drug-free sport is what all sports supposed to be. And, you know, it needs to be a serious degree of testing and falling in line with WADA guidelines. And that has changed so much in the last 20 years. Kind of the arguments of like, oh, the cheaters get away with it and all professional athletes are on drugs. You could have stood on, you know, two legs and said that in the 2000s, but it's really changed in the 2020s now with retrospective testing, storing drugs, and just kind of the throwaway statement of, you know, the people taking drugs are way ahead of the testers. It's actually just a lot less true these days. Most people aren't familiar with the type of testing that is done in serious organizations trying to catch people. So it would be interesting to see if it could get there. But I don't foresee that happening in the near future, or maybe even the moderate term future. I think there is a pathway back into the World Games, and I think that would be amazing. And that probably is the first step. And I hesitate to predict beyond that.
The World Games, That's something I'm not even familiar with. How come you wouldn't know how come? I'm just not familiar with it. So maybe you can maybe give a quick synopsis on that.
Yeah, it's very similar to the Olympics. It is organized under the IOC. It happens every 4 years, just shifted 1 year off cycle. And there's a tremendous number of sports that are represented in it. And you represent your country. And it's basically the Olympics for non-Olympic sports. Yeah, sumo wrestling's there, powerlifting is there. And like, for example, if you want to represent your country in the World Games for powerlifting, you have to place on the podium at last year's World Championships. It's like the champions of champions. It is the highest level
Cool.
competition you can do in non-Olympic sports. But the World Games has been going on, I want to say, since the 80s, and it's coming up in
Wow.
2025 in the summer. It's a big deal. And the IWGA, I believe, the International World Games Association, they're affiliated with the IOC. They're WADA tested. Yeah, it's definitely a pretty big thing. Obviously not as big as the Olympics. Everyone's heard of the Olympics. You only know about the
Yeah.
World Games because of this one. But I want to say maybe it's been around since before the 80s, maybe even the 70s. I know it's been televised since the 80s. So it's a pretty big deal. And I mean, there's a tremendous number of sports, but if you would go to it, it has a huge opening ceremony. Just like there's the Olympic Village, there's the World Games Village. It is pretty big and it is a big deal. Like countries are putting petitions forth to host it. Yeah, it's got, I don't know, double digit numbers of sports in it from everything. So yeah,
And
it's got a
so,
lot.
and that's if I think back to our conversation just now, bodybuilding has been in the World Games.
It has up until
Okay.
'09.
Up until '09. And we're talking about not drug-free bodybuilding though. Well,
Well, that's
technically
the
they
thing. It's
were.
supposed to be, which is why they got booted. So the IFBB
Got
did
it.
get World Games recognition, and I
Ah, I
want to
see
say they
now.
were
IFBB.
there, yeah, through the because yeah, again, the IFBB International is actually like has done some of the work to be registered with IOC. Here's something people don't know. When people talk about drug use and doping in sport and they use broad brushstrokes, you know they're really just not informed because there's a tremendous difference between sports, regions, and countries. Some countries are very serious about drug testing, others are not. So, one of the many facets, for example, that's most relevant to kind of the world we live in, to why weightlifting is not as successful in some of Western countries is because the weightlifting organizations do a good job of internal testing. Like if you're on a registered testing pool, they can just show up at your home between like an 18-hour window anytime and make you piss in a cup or take blood in some cases. And that random or even targeted knock knock, I'm testing you policy is one of the ways that you can maintain a pretty high degree of limiting the doping that occurs in the sport. Now, if that occurs in this country, but it does not occur in, say, an Eastern European country, or it's highly corrupt, or doesn't occur in a small Asian country, then when you go compete at the international level, you've got problems. So there's a big difference between competing in like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US, France, than there might be with competing in other countries. Interesting thing. So there's another thing called the Commonwealth Games, which I wouldn't expect you to be familiar with unless you're from Canada.
I am familiar with that one. Maybe because I'm
Okay,
from Canada though.
right. Okay, good, good. So Commonwealth Games is a big deal too. It occurs every on a semi-regular cycle as well. The Olympic weightlifting is there, and I didn't know about it until I came to New Zealand and I started working with weightlifters, and I became a weightlifter myself and competed in the IWF affiliate here. A lot of I'm going to say what other people are saying. This is not my opinion. I'm just going to repeat it. So, if you talk to a lot of high level New Zealand, Australian, and Canadian weightlifters, they basically consider Commonwealth Games like the drug free highest level competition, except for India. So it's like everyone's drug free, but not India is kind of the view. And there are some notable events that I'm not going to, get into where almost, the whole hosting nations team got banned because they failed the test. And then they had to bring in their B team who hadn't been tested. And, it is what it is. But I've met multiple high level New Zealand lifters here in New Zealand who they know the drug testing here is pretty legit. It's pretty legit in all these other countries. And it's true of almost all of the Commonwealth that the involved nations are pretty well drug tested, except for a few notable ones. So they kind of see it as, look, I'm not too interested in going to the Olympics because I know I'm competing against a lot of athletes from countries where they can get away with a lot of doping. But if I place really well at the Commonwealth Games, it's kind of like my natural Olympics for our sport. I don't know the veracity of that claim. I'm not saying that claim is 100% true, but I just think it's interesting when you look at the complexities of sport and region specific drug testing. It is very different and it is rapidly changing. And some of the kind of the beliefs people might have at different times and eras are outdated now and may only be true in certain regions, certain sports.